buonasera.
Buongiorno a tutti.
Buona
puntata dei Dialoghi di Urbisaglia.
Veramente immenso.
Ciao!
Buongiorno a tutti e ben trovati in questo nuovo appuntamento dei Dialoghi di Urbisaglia. Io sono Pierfilippo Saviotti. Oggi abbiamo il piacere di chiacchierare con Stefan Litt, che è archivista e bibliotecario presso la Biblioteca Nazionale di Israele a Gerusalemme. L'intervista si svolgerà in inglese, ma prima facciamo una breve presentazione del nostro ospite. Stefan Litt è dunque storico e archivista, attualmente è conservatore della sezione di umanistica della Biblioteca di Israele, dopo essere già stato dal 2011 archivista dei lasciti in lingua tedesca di autori e personaggi, tra cui Stefan Zweig, Franz Kafka e molti altri. Ha iniziato la sua carriera studiando alla Libera Università di Berlino e poi specializzandosi alla Hebrew University di Gerusalemme, proprio in studi ebraici, in storia delle comunità ebraiche. E ha insegnato poi presso l'Università Heinrich Heine di Düsseldorf ed è stato visiting professor all'Università Karl Franz di Graz in Austria. Oltre al ruolo di archivista e bibliotecario, Stefan Litt è attualmente molto proficuo anche nell'attività di studioso. Negli anni ha maturato diversi studi, diverse pubblicazioni, soprattutto nel campo degli studi ebraici, in particolare delle comunità ebraiche della Turingia nella prima età moderna e come vedremo anche con alcune incursioni nella storia del libro e dell'editoria ebraica. La sua attività di studioso ha assunto così una dimensione compiuta nel 2015 quando è stato insignito di un prestigioso premio intitolato il Rosalind Paul Ansberg Prize per un suo lavoro intitolato Jewish Community Status from the Ashkenazi Cultural Space. So Stefan, welcome and thank you for being with us in this close but far new appointment of the Dialoghi di Urbisaglia. I would like to start this interview with a general question about your job as a curator of the Humanities section of the National Library of Israel here in Jerusalem. What do you do, especially in this complicated period, and what the section you curate keeps in particular?
Yes, thank you for having me here, and hello to everyone. So I'm indeed one of the four specialized curators at the National Library. Each of us has a certain field of collection responsibility. There's just in a nutshell Judaism, the State of Israel, Islam and Middle East, and there's as well the general humanities collection, which mostly comprises books, journals, special materials like manuscripts, early prints, and so on in the field of history, general philosophy, the history of Christianity, theology, and classic studies, and so on and so forth. So that covers a very large field, of course, and by doing so, I would even say that maybe my work is the most developed in the field of curatorship, because we have really to pick our interests in the huge field of publications. We can, of course, not afford to buy simply everything. We would love to, but we can't do that, and therefore we have to really make clear decisions and definitions where to put our interest in and our money, of course. So our collection is quite developed. We have more than 600,000 books in that one. I believe it's about 500 running journals in any field of humanities. So we are moving on with those, and there's of course all the time a constant process of choosing additional books which have been recently published in a number of central languages. For instance, of course, first and foremost English, because we have to acknowledge the fact that most of our users are familiar to use English actively and passively, and with all the other languages it might be a bit more complicated. So we also acquire books in German and French, Italian, Spanish at large. So beyond that, we also have, as I mentioned before, a number of special collections which came to us in a kind of chance because by on the one hand side having such a diverse collection of humanities, we have to serve, of course, the general interest and cannot so much invest into special collections. But nevertheless, during the almost 130 years of the existence of the National Library in Israel, there have been several collectors who donated in the past their private collections to the National Library, and among those materials have been also items which do not belong to the fields of Judaism or Jewish studies in a wider sense, but they are clearly belonging to the history of Christianity, to philosophy, general history, and so on and so forth. So we do have a number of manuscripts going back to the 12th and 13th century from Europe. Christian manuscripts. Of course, we also have Christian manuscripts from North Africa, from Ethiopia. We have a number of incunabula. I'm right now doing a bit on research on the Christian incunabula collection, which is part of the National Library holdings. And we have about, I cannot say clearly yet because I haven't finished to see all the copies, we have about 170 copies, which is, to the best of my knowledge, the largest collection in Israel. It's a bit eclectic, though, because, again, there was no clearly defined policy to invest in incunabula. As we all know, they are pretty expensive, and you cannot just buy one and another one, but from time to time there have been some donations, and so in the course of the decades, there have been a number of items, and I believe that the most recent one is in around 2018, when the National Library purchased the huge Val Madonna Trust Library, which is was a private library collection in the field of Jewish studies, but also included a number of non-Jewish books. And with that, we got 3 new copies, which is, of course, nice for the collection. So right now I'm doing a kind of research on that, and in order to be a bit more able to say general sentences about that particular one.
But your research now is concerning about the Christians, especially the Christians in Cunabula and manuscript, or so. What about your study of this about this now?
Yes, well, actually, the manuscripts have been researched a bit before I got this position by my predecessor, and I could rely on that, and here and there some corrections, but she didn't have the time to invest more research into the incunabula collection. So this is what I'm right now doing. I built a list, a preliminary list, according to our catalog holdings, where I move forward printer by printer, and I check what books we have from each printer, and I check, of course, each copy in order to verify with the international inventory lists and on the internet if this copy is indeed one of the prints according to the catalog. And as you know, incunabula are unique books very often, because they usually did not remain just a blank printed copy, but there have been initials added, or glosses, or rebindings, or additional volumes have been this convolute. And so by checking each and every copy, I make clear what actually do we have, and my aim is to present one day a kind of general overview of the National Library incunabula's collection to researchers worldwide, of course.
And the humanities section keeps also a really interesting collection of history sciences, right? In particular, the collection of manuscripts of Isaac Newton. So yes. What about this section?
Yes, no one would really expect that the National Library of Israel in Jerusalem holds roughly maybe 1/3 of Isaac Newton's original papers, but this is the fact, and that goes back again to a very unique story of a private collector who, to whom we owe a lot concerning our collections in many fields, because he was such a diverse man. His name was Abraham Shalom Yehuda. He was Jerusalem born in the late 19th century. He was a son of a German Jewish mother and a Baghdadi Jewish father. And by this combination, he grew up in a number of languages, of course. And after finishing his school education here in Palestine, he went to Germany, studied Orientalism in Heidelberg, and got an academic position afterwards. And he was an obsessive collector, I would say, in his field, which means Oriental studies. So he collected hundreds, if not thousands, of Muslim manuscripts, beautiful ones, but also Jewish manuscripts. But he couldn't resist from time to time simply to buy other important collections or sub-collections whenever they were offered on the auction market in those days. So one of the things he couldn't resist was in 1936, when the family of Isaac Newton decided to sell his private papers, which were still belonging to the family. And of course, the first offer was given to the library, the University Library of Cambridge, where Isaac Newton used to study and to teach. But then in 1936, it was kind of not really fully acknowledged that Isaac Newton was not just a brilliant researcher in sciences, but that he was a universal man according to his time. Of course, it was not such a special thing that he also invested a lot of thoughts and writing into other fields, which were alchemy and theology. So the University of Cambridge then had a certain problem with those two fields and didn't show interest in the papers related to that. So they ended up at the auction market, and there were two gentlemen who did show interest in these papers. One was John Maynard Keynes, the economist, who was showing interest in alchemy, and Abraham Shalom Yehuda was showing interest in theology. And so they bought together the whole collection and sorted out afterwards belonging to each one, and separated by doing so the collection again. And Abraham Shalom Yehuda bequeathed his complete personal archive and collection, which is huge, to the National Library of Israel, and since 1969 it belongs to us. And the collection has been digitized completely, of course, which is quite easy in that sense because it's attractive material and it's, of course, public domain. You don't have to be worried about the question of copyright. And it was even declared one of the collections of the UNESCO collections of human or culture of humanity, I believe it's called. I cannot recall the correct name. And so that's one of our most attractive collections, of course. And very often it has been used by researchers worldwide who came here to Jerusalem in order to check the papers in original, of course.
Yeah, for sure. Is really interesting also this part of the section. But at the beginning, I mentioned also your activity as a researcher. So your studies concern about the history, especially about the history of Jewish community, but also about the Jewish publishing and the Jewish book trade, right? Mm-hmm. So what about this part of your activity, and what the state of your yes. study now?
That's correct. That's something that actually I was able to preserve from my past before I entered the team of the National Library. I was doing actively research in that field. And the last big research project I was part of more than 10 years ago dealt with general question of the Republic of Letters of the Jewish Enlightened sphere, mostly in Germany or in Central Europe, let's put it like that. And our questions were related to who belonged actually to that Republic of Letters, not just according to the titles of the books and the authors of the books, but much beyond that. Who were the printers, who were the distributors, and maybe also who were the audience of those books, which were kind of revolutionary because they broke with the traditional Jewish thinking and were much more focused in modern thinking by accepting general trends of philosophy and enlightenment, of course. So we built a bunch of, or we built actually a kind of a database where we collected all the data available, and my part in it was to check what about the ways of distributing those special books. And it was very thrilling to see that very soon those Jewish enlightened people adapted this technology of subscription, which they have been aware of from their Christian counterpart. Also Christian enlightened thinkers in their time had to find new ways of distributing their works and selling them to the intended audience because of their sometimes complicated and not totally welcomed contents. They were not part of the general book market, and so there have been new technologies both of advertising books by printing small leaflets informing about new publications, and even advertisement in the first Jewish enlightened journal, which was Hammer by edited by Moses Mendelssohn, and there was a section of new books. So that was something very revolutionary for the Jewish book market, unseen before. And I also checked more and more the subscription lists, which very often have been printed and are part of the book, either in the beginning or in the last section of the book, where you can really reconstruct at least who bought the book. Of course, that doesn't necessarily mean that these people also read the books, but at least they did show some interest in it. And that was interesting and thrilling to us to see who were these people, because there's some, of course, data, historic data and other sources related to these people, usually quite successful business people and their families. But it was also interesting to see that even Christian readers did show interest in Jewish enlightened books, whether they have been in Hebrew or in German. So that was a total new finding for us, and I very much enjoyed that time. And since then, I developed my focus a bit more, because I was asking myself how, in general, Jewish book trade was going on in early modern period. From, let's say, the 16th century, when Jewish book printing was becoming a substantial part of the general book market, and until the 19th century, when Jewish books did play a role in general book trade, of course. But before that, that was a kind of special section, and my question still is, how did it actually work? How books printed in Amsterdam ended up in Poland, and how books printed in Venice were ordered by Bohemian Jews, and how did they get there? Who were the mediators, the traders, who did the business, on what base, and so on. So very interesting questions, and sometimes very, very few sources for it. And so I'm still looking for, but in the meantime, I was able to localize some important information, which hopefully will shed some more light in the future on that.
So are you preparing now some works or paper about this we can expect in the next future?
Yes, I do think at least preparing a larger paper on it, and I still have the feeling it might be even a small monograph. So I'm still deliberating with myself what to do with the with the findings and in which format to present it. But they build something in that style for sure.
So very good. We can expect your job soon. And a last question about a book you published in the last days. About the title is Stefan Zweig, Briefe zum Judentum. I'm sorry for the for the pronunciation. That we can translate as Stefan Zweig letters about Judaism. Is right?
Exactly,
What
correct.
about your study
Yes,
about this?
yes, that was actually born out of my second field of responsibility in the National Library. As you said before in the introduction, I'm also archivist responsible for the mostly German-speaking holdings in the National Library. We have lots of collections and very prominent ones in our holdings. Among those, there's a very developed and interesting Stefan Zweig collection, and he became kind of my hero because he's such a convincing writer still in my eyes, even after 100 years, and such a great humanist and pacifistic figure and thinker. And I remember that more or less 4 years ago, I received a phone call by an old lady living here in Israel, and she was offering to us a bunch of original letters from Stefan Zweig to her former stepfather. And I was, of course, absolutely thrilled about this offer, and I visited her at her home, and she indeed gave me a bunch of 26 letters and 6 postcards or so. And but when I traveled back to the National Library in the train, I was, of course, very curious and started reading the letters. And I was struck by the openness in which Stefan Zweig in 1921 described his very complex attitude about his own Jewish identity, about questions of Zionism, whether to believe in it or to follow it, or whether to leave it aside and simply to go on as a Jew living in the diaspora on its own values. And then I asked to myself, okay, if he's deliberating or developing this topic very openly to actually unknown young men, what about his friends? What did he write them about his own feelings, identity questions? And I was checking a lot of archives and collections worldwide, including Germany, Austria, United States, England, and so on and so forth. And I was able to find, let's say, about 140 letters in which he develops the topic in a way. And 120 out of them were convincing enough to say, okay, I make an edition, very special edition on this topic. Zweig's letters related to Jewish items, questions, and so on. And so I'm really happy that it now, a couple of days ago, was published in German, in its German original first, and maybe hopefully also in translation, which is we'll see.
So, Stefan, thank you very much for this beautiful and really precious overview of a small part of the National Library of Israel, a small but really interesting part of the National Library, and also for some interesting hints about your activity as a researcher. So, thank you very much.
Thank you for having me here, and you all are invited to visit the library whenever it will be possible, of course.
It could be a pleasure, let's hope, as soon as possible.
Yes. Fingers crossed.
Fingers crossed. Quindi ringraziamo Stefan Litt per il tempo che ci ha dedicato, per questa molto interessante panoramica sul suo lavoro e sulla sua attività, e quindi appuntamento alla prossima intervista con i dialoghi di Urbisaglia. A presto.